be misleading unless you see the subtle use of words that are involved. Because on the one hand, he has rejected any metaphysic of forms. That is to say, he's not a realist in the medieval sense of real universals. He rejects any metaphysic of forms. If there are final causes, that is to say, purposes involved in nature, well, we'll have to leave that to the theologians. It's not accessible by rational means, by empirical means. So instead of a metaphysic of forms, he's turning to an empirical science that aims to discover forms. And if you're not careful, you might read the second sense of forms as the same as the first sense of forms, which it is not. The second sense of form is just the uniform way in which natural processes proceed. That is to say, when A is routinely followed by B, you're getting that form of behavior in the natural processes, and he wants a method which can get at this kind of form. The form has to do with processes that are entirely due to the operation of physical forces in the material world. Physical forces in the material world. And the philosopher whom he cites most appreciatively in this regard is, as you might expect with the rise of mechanistic science, Democritus, the Greek atomist, everything understood in terms of matter and motion, though in his own time the most significant scientist undoubtedly was, of course, Galileo, who thought in similar Democritan kinds of terms. So this is his purpose. His method, an empirical science of forms, is what we will see gives him concern to develop appropriate inductive methods, inductive logic, rather than deductive. Let me add this footnote, that in criticizing deductive reasoning, he has little appreciation for what syllogisms can establish. The problem is not with the process of inference involved in syllogisms. The problem is not with the laws of logic. He's too wise for that. The problem is finding premises. Now, that was precisely the problem which Aristotle put his fingers on, you remember, in that long opening section of the Posterior Analytics. Where do we get the first principles for demonstration? Plato had said by dialectic. Aristotle poses the problem of an infinite regress of first principles, or of a circular argument about first principles, and finally comes down to the notion that we are able intuitively to abstract the first principle, the form of the species, from the experience that we have cumulatively of a whole species. Now, it's that process of intuitive abstraction which Bacon does not like. He talks in one place of improperly and hastily abstracted concepts that render syllogistic reasoning useless. Aristotle's abstraction of forms from species. You see. He has little respect for it. Yet the interesting thing is that while Aristotle called that process induction, By induction, we know the forms. Bacon also calls the process induction. By induction, we know the forms. But since induction of forms in the first sense, Aristotle's sense, induction through intuitive abstraction, is inaccurate, insufficient, imprecise, he wants, obviously, another kind of inductive method in dealing with forms in the second sense. So watch the vocabulary. I think it's part of his literary craft, and he is really a Renaissance literary figure. But it's part of his literary craft, you see, that he speaks of forms, induction as the method of knowing the forms, which is Aristotelian language, but it's not Aristotelian concepts. He's changing the objects of knowledge and changing the methods of knowing. It's knowing by the new method of this new object of knowledge that is going to give power. Knowledge by the old kind of method of the old objects of knowledge does not, he thinks, give power over nature. Okay? So what he wants then is an empirical science dealing with forces in the material world. Knowledge then is of instrumental value. He's not after truth for its own sake, understanding for its own sake. He doesn't see the road to truth as the ladder to the contemplation of God, as the medievals did. He does not see the road to truth as the way to the contemplation of God. Contemplating the forms, rising to the contemplation of the form of all forms, the good, you see. No, that's not his hierarchy of being. It's not his worldview. He sees God as creator, but our responsibility in nature is this creation mandate to dominion for the sake of the kingdom of God. Now, if you can hold that line of thought in mind, let me add one other piece of historical context that looks further forward. There are really just two or three key themes associated with Bacon that we need to get a hold of. One certainly is his conception of induction. The second is that knowledge is power in relationship to power over nature, creation mandate. But the third is the assumption that this kind of scientific knowledge can be entirely objective. The idea that scientific knowledge can be entirely objective. The idea that science tells us about reality. Not realism about universals, but realism about scientific knowledge. And this emphasis is what he transmits to the Enlightenment, that comes out most forcibly, most influentially in the Scottish realism of the next century, the 18th century, in which connection reference is constantly made, both in people like Thomas Reid, the Scottish realist, we'll meet him later on, And in recent writings about Scottish realism, because that's been going through a revival of interest over the last 10 years. Among the people who've revived interest in it is Mark Knoll, through his research and writing on American intellectual history. But the constant reference in connection with Scottish realism is to the Baconian view of science. Baconian science. Meaning science that's completely objective, science which is purely empirical, science which has no presuppositions, you see. Science which is the same for anybody, Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, complete naturalist, you see. Objective, empirical science telling us, as it tells anybody, about the realities of nature. Okay. Now, the result in that Scottish realist tradition was that it came to be believed that modern science gave us a firm foundation of common knowledge on the basis of which a culture can develop its own superstructure, on the basis of which there can be developed philosophical theology, apologetics, and so on and so forth. And for some of you interested in theology, apologetics, the influence of it came particularly to this country at Princeton, through Witherspoon when he came to be president of Princeton College, so that Princeton College, Princeton Seminary, the two, became the conduit into American thought of Scottish realism. The classic Presbyterian theologian of the 1860s, Charles Hodge, really approaches his whole theology on a Baconian basis, taking it that science tells us the realities, and on that basis we can argue the existence of God, you see, and human freedom and responsibility, etc., etc. And that influence, very widespread, here at Wheaton included. Let's see, J. Oliver Buswell, who was the third president, very definitely Scottish realist, he was philosopher, theologian, wrote extensively on Scottish realism, and had quite an influence in that regard. When I was an undergraduate here, I was introduced to philosophy in terms of Scottish realism. Not because I studied under the third president, though I studied under a man who had studied under the third president when he taught elsewhere after leaving me. So, that Baconian influence in Scottish realism has influenced the American evangelical thought. Now I think it is much less influential distinctively among evangelicals, unless you go to Asbury College and Seminary, where it is the dominating philosophical mood. The revival of Scottish realism is more in contemporary American epistemology, interestingly. Much more widespread than it used to be. Okay, so three things then about Bacon to keep in mind. Okay. One is inductive method